It's my distinct pleasure and honor to introduce our speaker, who's going to share some of the work she's been doing recently. Beatriz del Cueto, FAAR 12. She is from AIA Puerto Rico, and she actually did go to the University of Florida, so she's in the neighborhood for those of us who are Floridians. She's a founding partner of Pantel del Cueto and Associates in Puerto Rico. She's a conservation architect. She's a well-known authority inside and outside the field in the field of built heritage restoration. She's a member of the Fellow of the American Institute of Architects, the American Academy in Rome, and the James Marsden Fitch Foundation. Her projects and research have been awarded and published in prestigious journals worldwide. And she has received from AIA Puerto Rico, the Architects and Landscape Association of Puerto Rico, the highest honor that they can bestow on an architect, the Henry Club Award. She was the first director of the Architectural Conservation Laboratory of the School of Architecture of the Polytechnic University of Puerto Rico. Oh my God, that's a tongue twister. Sorry, Beatriz. Where she taught for 17 years. She's also an associate professor at the graduate program at Columbia, and has researched and written about traditional building materials in the Caribbean. And she just finished her doctorate, her PhD in architecture building from the University of Valencia and Polytechnic University of Valencia in Spain. And she's going to be sharing the work she's been doing. And I'm really good at chopping people's bio off. So I am going to leave the Beatriz to tell us all about the work she has been doing and the work of the research she did. And with that, the floor is yours, Beatriz.
Hi, good morning, everyone. I hope you can see me or hear me. Okay. I thank Lourdes and AIA Florida and AIA Miami for the invitation to talk to you this morning regarding my thesis. It's really an honor to be here. And I wanted to, faster than anything, answer what Lourdes asked me the first time: why and how come you have the time? I did my doctoral dissertation because I could and I wanted to do it. Like Lourdes said, I'm in my profession as a researcher within the architectural conservation field. My passion is researching. So every time I find something that I don't understand or that I need to clarify for anybody, I seek funds and I go for it. So this time I went overboard, and it was 3 years of a doctoral degree, but I'm happy to say that my thesis will be published. So that's a very important thing for me. As an architect, I'm going to read part of the presentation because I tend to speak too much. So I need to cut it back so that we have enough time for questions. As an architect, I've always been interested in how buildings are built, as well as knowing the components and the products and raw materials that are specified for a project. Hence the title of my doctoral thesis, New Materials and Technologies in the Spanish Caribbean and Its Pioneers. As a Cuban born in Havana, I don't know how to make these go, Becky. How do I go from one slide to the other? Because I'm moving.
You should be able to hit your down arrow or page down.
Page down? Yeah, I'm moving it page down, but it's not moving. Hold on for a minute. What? I have to be on the screen. Okay. Technical support from my husband here. Thank you. Okay. As a Cuban born in Havana, I know the Greater Antilles well, and specifically those that make up the Spanish Caribbean. Cuba, Hispaniola, specifically the Dominican Republic on the east, and Puerto Rico, where I have lived most of my life and where I have my family. I left my native country at a very young age, and with this research, I was able to rediscover Cuba, even though 53 years had passed since my family's departure. As a university lecturer professor specializing in historic preservation and conservation, the buildings we normally studied were built with traditional lime-based technologies from the Spanish colonization period between the 16th to the 19th century. These studies included the lime staking process and the magic of turning this mix into a hydraulic mortar by blending it with finely ground brick dust. I was unaware then of the specific qualities of cement to hydraulic mortars as a substitute, affecting both buildings and the urban profile of our cities. A project of our historic preservation firm aroused my interest in two specific prefabricated cement materials, the hydraulic mosaic tiles and concrete block. When formally investigating these, I had the opportunity to travel to the Dominican Republic and Cuba, where from a professional point of view, I saw these building materials and their use in a very different way. Particularly in Cuba, I studied the buildings that had the most relevant examples of the two materials I was investigating. When I asked basic information about numerous emblematic buildings in La Habana, the usual answer was that it had been built by the American engineering firm of Purdy and Henderson. Many in Cuba knew the name of the firm, but there was very little or no information available about their work, including buildings of importance like the Capitol, the Hotel Nacional, and the Centro Gallego, among many others in the capital city. As a result, my next research project focused on increasing my knowledge about this company and had built impressive landmark architecture in Havana and their origins in the United States. My return to Havana 2 additional times was essential to investigate these individuals that everyone knew but had few details about their Cuban work. In addition, it gave me the opportunity to rediscover places from my childhood and get to know the wonderful Cuban landscape from an architect's point of view. This project was approached in a transdisciplinary format from its architectural, social, economic, and heritage history in order to cover all the aspects that affected design and construction. In order to achieve this, several sources were researched and included, such as national and local archives, national and private libraries, private depositories and collections, online sources, and personally photographing the building selected. Building methodologies evolve. There are several common denominators in the Spanish Caribbean that affected design. Our cultural baggage, that is, our historical roots, the island geography, the climate, the types of natural disasters, and the flora and the fauna. The trade routes for the importation of building materials, merchants, and artisans from the old and new worlds made the West Indies or the Caribbean into an important stopover that eventually promoted urban expansions, the manufacture of prefabricated materials, fast and innovative designs, and the use of light steel frames. The hot and humid tropical climate facilitated the rapid setting of the new material known as plastic stone or cement. The use of standardized mold with a cement mortar allowed prefabrication and facilitated installation. Immigrations from Spain and the United States promoted the foundation of the first cement factory in the region near Havana in 1895. After the Spanish-Cuban War of 1898, there was a period of economic growth spurred by sugar sales, which resulted in an increase in construction projects and the subsequent use of cement and its byproducts as a main building material for a region eager to modernize. The arrival of iron as a result of the Industrial Revolution, which fomented railways and infrastructure worldwide, also revolutionized the sugarcane crushing machinery that accelerated the processing and production of sugarcane in the Caribbean. This material proved indispensable for international expositions and fairs, like the 1893 Columbian Exposition in Chicago, with lightweight and high-rise structures plus the need for worldwide infrastructure. Despite the establishment of local cement factories, imports from the United States and Europe continued, announcing it as permanent, waterproof, and fireproof. Residences began to be built with cement because of its hardness, easy use for island workers, and the protection it provided against natural disasters. It was fast-setting and provided early strength. At the end of the 19th century, the catalogs of hydraulic cement tiles or mosaics and the tiles themselves arrived in the region together with merchants and artisans versed in their manual manufacture and installation, The hydraulic tile of Catalan and French invention was considered a metaphor for the textile carpet and included the eclectic and modernist styles. It was an imitation material that generated heated discussions among those traditionalists who were against imitations that cheapened interiors. Regional designs included themes related to the flora and fauna of the Caribbean, as the slide shows. Concrete blocks or true artificial stones was a purely American product and invention in use since 1901. It was introduced in the Spanish Caribbean region mainly by evangelical missionaries who imported the metal molds to make the blocks and used them for the construction of their temples, schools, and hospitals in the new territories. The machine with the molds, used to make the units one by one, was simple and did not require previous experience. The blocks were made on site where they would be manufactured with a fine aggregate or sand in the same project subsoil and cement, since finished blocks did not travel well over rudimentary roads. Catalogs disseminated artificial stone products or cement blocks. Even though they varied in design, like the mosaic floor tiles, they were the subject of heated discussions and controversy with the purists, since they imitated stonework construction and their appearance was monotonous. The extensive use of iron for railways eventually led to the invention of more durable steel, used to create the framework for buildings that were lighter and more resistant to the ravages of weather. Steel evolved to become an effective building frame due to the speed of its construction and by allowing buildings to be taller and longer. An open structure provided wide spaces with large windows and better illuminated and ventilated interiors. Steel structures in Havana modernized the city's skyline, including the steel frame used to build the Capitol. Concrete, composed of sand, cement, and medium aggregate mortar, eventually became the most useful material for all types of structures in the region. Local masons, accustomed to using formwork to build rubble masonry and mud walls, found it an easy adaptation using the same form method to build with unreinforced and reinforced concrete. This new material, strengthened with reinforcement bars, was rapidly approved by local building codes for the large-scale residential construction. The resistance of these technologies against natural disasters made it the preferred technology throughout the Caribbean. The new materials provided a radical change in the region. In the three capitals of these island countries, there was a rapid evolution in the use of plastic stone or cement for buildings that were ever taller, more ornate, and more durable. The Purdy and Henderson Company. The decision to use the Purdy and Henderson Company as the research topic of the modern processes to build was a logical choice, which was facilitated by the quantity, quality, importance, and permanence of the projects achieved by this company in Havana and other cities and towns within the Spanish Caribbean during the first 3 decades of the 20th century. Engineer Corydon Purdy promoted the structural engineer as an important consultant in the service of architects. He was a pioneer in steel construction in the United States and later abroad, like in Cuba and the Spanish Caribbean. During the 1893 Columbian Exposition in Chicago, he partnered with one of his employees, engineer Lightner Henderson, and so the Purdy and Henderson Company was founded. During and before the Columbian Exposition, they had already become consulting engineers for major architectural firms such as Holabird and Roach and Burnham and Root for important buildings such as the Marquette, the Republic, the Rand McNally, and the Reliance buildings in Chicago. After the Exposition, projects dwindled. Purdy headed to New York, where they eventually got their first project with the expansion of the Waldorf Astoria Hotel. They were the structural consultants for significant large-scale skyscrapers, such as the Flatiron, the Broadway Chambers, for the New York Times building, which was the first structure built on top of a subway line, the Metropolitan Life Tower, and Grand Central Station. The period between 1890 and 1910, when there was intellectual, professional, and commercial progress in the United States, was called the Gilded Age. It was during this time that the Pennsylvania train station in New York City became the first exposed steel structure in the United States and most important structural project in the country at the time. The Pennsylvania train station brought together three highly qualified professionals. Architect Stanford White of McKim, Mead & White designed it. Engineer Leitner Henderson of P&H served as a structural engineer. And Valencian architect engineer Rafael Guastavino added his famous brick vaults to the station. These professionals may have met at the Columbian Exposition in Chicago, where the three of them participated and subsequently coincided again in this project. By then, Purdy and Henderson had four established branches: Chicago, New York, Boston, and the Havana branch, which appears to have been the last one established before the publication of these ads. Other branches that the company had were eventually adversely affected by the early death of engineer Henderson and by the First World War. It is important to note that Purdy and Henderson was a company that maintained the loyalty of its employees and even employed members from the same family. In a total of 109 years, the company had 5 presidents, of whom Leonard Brownson, father and son, were presidents of both the Havana and the New York branches. A new century, globalization of the company. Cuba was a significant theater of operations and a land coveted by both the Spanish, which had it as colony for 400 years, and the United States, specifically because of its geographical location on the route to the Panama Canal and its proximity to the USA. The United States saw Cuba as a place of great commercial opportunities, and for self-profit decided to support the Cuban people who had, by 1897, been fighting against the Spanish for 10 years to obtain their independence. The Panama Canal was seen as an opportunity for global trade. After winning the war, the Americans proposed cutting the island of Cuba in half to shorten the nautical distance between the American ports and the proposed canal. These initiatives were followed by much advertisement for Americans to invest and do business in Cuba. As a result, all kinds of construction materials and equipment companies established overseas branches, cement being one of the most needed products. Among the land and sea transportation that facilitated both the import and export of materials and equipment to and from Cuba were the North American train lines, which loaded wagons on both sides of the sea and transferred the entire trains onto ferries to facilitate shipments and regional trade. The establishment of the United States in Cuba guaranteed and facilitated development and construction work for North American companies such as Purdy and Henderson. Due to the decrease in projects in their other branches at the end of the 19th century, Engineer Purdy, on the left, older by then, traveled to Cuba in 1899 during the war to investigate the possibility of establishing their first overseas branch in the Caribbean. He took with him Mr. Leonard Brownson, who he would leave established in Havana, naming him the first president of the Cuban branch. The Republic of Cuba was founded in 1902, but the U.S. maintained control of the elected governments and the most significant and comprehensive building projects. Large important projects such as the National Bank and the National Hotel were also constructed during this period. Purdy and Henderson were also responsible for building the first 2 skyscrapers in Havana, which were the Banco Nacional in 1908 and the Lonja del Comercio in 1909. The height of these buildings was 5 to 6 stories high, which, due to their amplified floor-to-ceiling height, was equivalent to 9 building levels elsewhere. In 1863, the demolition of the western edge of the colonial city wall of Havana allowed the expansion of neighborhoods on this side of the capital city. This segment is still called the Barrio de las Murallas. For scale, Havana's expansion is equivalent to that of Manhattan Island in New York, which is approximately 202 square miles. So you can understand a little bit the scale of Havana. Despite the increase in the U.S. presence in business and projects, there was a second construction of emblematic buildings by the Spanish communities that remained in Cuba and included the Centro Gallego and the Centro Asturiano, among others. As president of the Cuban branch of PH, Brownson was a person involved in all manners of social and commercial activities in Cuba, where he was always present. He was the president of banks and prominent social entities. The P&H company continuously promoted themselves in the news media and through technical journal articles in both Cuba and the United States. The name of the company was often published in both newspapers and magazines and included the materials and equipment that they imported, not only for their own projects, but as providers for Cuban projects in general. Maps of old Havana and El Vedado show the number of important buildings built in Havana by Purdy and Henderson during approximately 60 years, from the Hotel Miramar in 1904 to the structure for the Cuban Naval Headquarters in 1952. Emblematic projects in Havana. Due to the great diversity of work that Purdy and Henderson built in Havana, the following building list is organized in chronological order by use and building type. Dates included are when the projects were completed. The Colegios Profesionales, or professional associations for architects and engineers, were founded to differentiate and protect the roles of each profession, emulating the Spanish formats. When Purdy and Henderson arrived in Cuba, they realized that they could not design on their own and that they had to associate with a licensed Cuban professional to practice, therein obligating the creation of professional alliances. From their first projects, there is documentation of Purdy and Henderson's collaboration with engineer-architect Jose Francisco Torraya, who was a renowned professional in Havana and had studied engineering in London and architecture in Madrid. This collaboration lasted for many years until his death in 1916. The plans for the projects were bilingual, since Torraya prepared his plans in Spanish and Purdy and Henderson prepared them in English, as confirmed by historical documents. This alliance allowed Purdy and Henderson to become contractors and building inspectors, as well as consultants to the architects with whom they partnered and who assumed responsibility for each of the projects under Cuban law. The establishment of factories to produce cement began in Cuba in 1895 with the Cuba brand. Production continued with the Almendares factory in 1901 with its Volcan cement, and by the second decade of the 20th century, the El Morro cement was founded and eventually specified and used for all government construction projects in Cuba. The materials most used in the early projects of the alliance between Purdy and Henderson and Torraya were steel frames covered by reinforced concrete and cast stone, as well as concrete blocks. Steel companies established branches in Cuba to facilitate their distribution due to the increasing number of projects being built on the island with this material. Imported and experienced North American steel workers trained young Cubans in the trade who quickly mastered the manufacture of these frames. The cigar factory in Havana, with material from Milliken Steel Company, was the first structure built with these materials in Havana and was published in the company's catalog in 1902, when it was labeled an American version of modernity. The concrete floors for these structures were also illustrated in their international catalogs. Reinforced concrete was used to finish the entire structures for its resistance to hurricanes and earthquakes. Similarly, the important machines and molds for the manufacture of both the cast stone that would cover these frames and the concrete block allowed the designers to use precast materials that Purdy and Henderson had previously specified and were intimately familiar with. Purdy and Henderson designed a water-repellent concrete block specifically for its Havana projects where high water tables were a problem. These blocks solved the problem, especially for the first basement built in the capital city to house the National Bank's vault. These blocks were fireproof as well as waterproof. Molded architecture composed of prefabricated parts was a lucrative business since it was easy and convenient to consult a catalog and choose the desired ornamentation. The map of Old Havana shows 29 projects that Purdy and Henderson built or remodeled in this sector of the city. The 12 most outstanding cases have been selected to explain the technologies used and the building's present state. El Hotel Miramar was built in 1904, designed by architect José Torraya. It was the first building constructed by P&H in Cuba. It employed modern technology of steel frame covered with cast stone and water repellent blocks. The speed of construction was a notable element and guaranteed stronger buildings against the effects of hurricanes and earthquakes. The Hotel Nacional was finished in 1930, designed by McKim, Mead and White from New York in another collaboration with Purdy and Henderson. Steel structures were covered with natural stone from Cuban quarries and molded cast stone in the upper parts of the building. A coup d'etat of the government in 1933 led military personnel to take shelter in this building for its publicized strength and resistance. The hotel has survived in excellent condition due to continued use and continued maintenance. The Banco Nacional, or National Bank, was built in 1908. It was designed by architect José Torraya. It was the first building which included technical specifications on the required fireproof quality of a building, including 3 water tanks on the roof in case of fire. Steel reinforcement with 403 columns and 600 wood piles due to high water table was its structural support. Hollow clay tile block to cover columns and used for interior partitions. It was the first skyscraper in Havana, 5 stories high, equivalent to 9 levels elsewhere. Lush interiors, including 20-foot tall columns supporting a leaded glass barrel vaulted skylight in the main lobby, were its main features and still exist. Special drainage system and use of waterproof block designed by P&H was used to withstand the high water table. The Centro Gallego, or Galician Center, was completed in 1915. It was designed by Belgian architect Paul Belau in conjunction with architect Torraya. It was steel with natural stone from Cuban quarries, which were mostly required from local projects in Cuba to use the natural resources of the country. It is a superlative example of the encapsulation of an existing historic structure within the urban block where it was to be built. The 1838 Teatro Tacón remained within the premises of the new project, even maintaining its own original facades. There was an automatic fire suppression system, 1,000 seats, elaborate facades, and skylight. Presently, it's been completely rehabilitated, and the theater is the place for major theatrical performances. The Residencia Marqués de Avilés of 1916 was designed by American architect Thomas Hastings from the Carrera and Hastings studio in New York. It's steel with cast stone finishes with facilitated light and strong roofs. For me, it was really surprising to find residences built with steel frame, but it was very commonplace after Purdy and Henderson started doing this, that the work of this type of construction continued. La Lonja del Comercio, or the Produce Exchange Building of 1909, was designed by Spanish architect Tomás Moore with architect José Torraya. As you can see, Torraya was everywhere at the beginning. It was the second skyscraper in Havana, also built by P&H. Steel with cast stone finishes that were manufactured in Cuba were its main building material. It was also designed to be fire, earthquake, and hurricane proof. One unusual and very particular material was the floor slab system, which consisted of twisted wires and concrete called the Metropolitan floor, which was fireproofed and recognized as that most resistant, not only for the load they had to bear, but also for the action against fire. It has a very prominent use nowadays, including major TV and radio stations. El Capitolio was finished in 1929. It was designed by Govantes and Cabarroca firm with Raúl Rainieri, with steel frame with natural stone, again being demanded by the Cuban government, reinforced concrete floor and ceiling slabs. Special equipment had to be imported to Cuba by P&H for the construction and stone cutting of this major structure. As you can see from the comparisons of the images on the left, it was a competition for the dome height. So basically, the Capitolio de Cuba's dome sits between St. Peter in Rome and the Capitol in Washington, D.C. P&H joined its design employees with those of the Secretary of Public Works Office to complete the plans as the fast-track project progressed. There were 1,000 day workers and 400 night workers, which completed the largest building in Havana in a period of 3 years and 50 days. Recently completed was its complete restoration, and I'm happy to say it's being used again. The grand staircase for the University of Havana was completed in 1927, a project by Cesar Guerra. It was built through a presidential decree as a fast-track project to be completed by P&H, who were then building the Capitolio as well. The grand staircase was built of reinforced concrete paved with marble. There, as you can see, it still remains and it's still a very emblematic feature within Havana's cityscape. There were also additions and remodeling projects. This is the Hotel Inglaterra, for which they built they covered the interior patio to make it into a skylight in as early as 1909. El Calvario Baptist Church of 1921, following the example of the Centro Gallego, the old Hané Circus Theater from 1899 was encapsulated within the new church. This is the reason for the horse-shaped plan, ceiling height, and elaborate iron structure that was visible and exposed from its inauguration, a first in Cuba. Between the 1930s to the 1950s, there was a major disruption. And by then, Purdy and Henderson had just 2 branches left, the Havana, that in Havana and that in New York. According to documents found in Havana, there were few projects during this period, possibly due to the New York stock market crash, the Second World War, and the political instability of Cuba. Regardless, 2 important buildings were constructed during this time, amongst others. This is the Radio Centro building, designed by Emilio del Junco, Miguel Gaston, and Martín Domínguez Associates, which was the first multifunctional building in Cuba. It was built with a steel frame, reinforced concrete, hollow clay ceramic tile, and brick. The theater structure was 4 stories high, is 4 stories high, with a capacity for 1,600 seats and a 5-story tower for offices. It was the first air-conditioned building in Havana. The Cuban Naval Headquarters of 1953 was designed by Ricardo Franklin, who had worked for P&H since he was a draftsman. It's steel with reinforced concrete and brick partitions. This is my supersonic favorite project. And a facade covered with natural stone, and also has still has marine interior motifs. Restoration and rehabilitation. Although this is my specialty within the architectural profession, research could not provide much data because the entrance to all buildings being remodeled in Cuba was and is still prohibited, nor was it possible to obtain detailed information about the ongoing process. As the included graphics indicate, to document the present state of the structure, and in the absence of original historic construction documents or non-destructive radar technologies, many of the restoration or rehabilitation investigations in Cuba are destructive in nature. This is even more regretful when we found evidence that prior to more recent interventions, the structures that P&H built at the beginning of the 20th century were mostly intact despite the neglect, disuse, and lack of maintenance through time. The Banco Nacional was the only building sampled through an alliance with the Cuban Structural Analysis working on the project. Scientific analysis of the finishes of the plastered columns in the main lobby were found to have false marble scagliola decoration. The Centro de Gallego extensive facade cleaning and restoration process took place from 2013 to 2015. They updated the theater to accommodate 900 people. There was an extensive technical study carried out, which was published. The Capitolio, as I just showed you, became the National Restoration, was awarded the National Restoration Prize of 2021 and selected as the rehab project to celebrate the 500 years of the founding of Havana. All systems were replaced and there was a detailed restoration of the dome and lantern, which were in a dire state. They also had an important collaboration from Italian and Russian Federation technicians and artists, in addition to the Cuban specialists in the same field. The end of the beginning. It's not good because it's old. It's old because it's good. Cuba was and will be a land of contrast and contradictions, a place of interest for immigrants from progressive places like Barcelona. And by 1895, it had established the first cement plant in the Spanish Caribbean. Being modern and progressive implied complying with speed, economy, efficiency, versatility, and fire retardant qualities, which were then required in a rapidly evolving construction universe. The beginning of the 20th century in the Spanish Caribbean was a moment which everything seemed possible, when new trends would be embraced with passion and without restrictions, which would result in architectural expressions like the islands themselves, exuberant, colorful, bold, and exciting. Purdy and Henderson were important pioneers in the construction field from the late 19th century, first in Chicago, then in New York, where they experimented with steel framing for a new and fast-paced world. As such, they specified the use of new materials such as Portland cement and its products and invented substitutes, such as the water repellent and fire retardant concrete blocks, which debuted in Cuba. The Havana branch of Purdy and Henderson Company diversified to survive a considerable business evolution that included engineers as well as consultants, construction inspectors, and importers of building equipment and materials. They always used the best methods with a superior team, which oftentimes they imported to Cuba to ensure the processes as specified. The technical specification mostly used by PH in Cuba included steel frames covered with ornamental cast stone, concrete blocks, and reinforced concrete, which would protect the steel from the ocean's salt spray, which was also always present on an island. This steel technology covered with cement materials was repeatedly used to lighten and accelerate construction, allowing greater heights, and with the belief that it helped protect structures from the effects of hurricanes and earthquakes. We must consider the important role that consulting engineers as well as contractors play in a project, often improving the final version of an architectural design. P&H must have been excellent bosses, reflected in the loyalty of a staff of employees and partners that endured, oftentimes being the only job they had during their professional lifetime, and as such, contributing with their best talent. The most impressive results of this research have been the realization of how both good design and excellent construction methods can even survive the worst neglect. As a company, Purdy and Henderson established new means, methods, and materials for building, and to them, their employees and partners, we owe our gratitude. If architecture is built poetry, Purdy and Henderson left us volumes of worthy examples. Gracias.
Wow. Wait, am I? That was amazing, Beatriz. That was quite a lot of information that you managed to summarize quite well. I'm very impressed. Rosa had a question, your friend, and she wrote it, but I'd rather she write it if she say it, because she'll explain it a little bit better than I would. So Rosa.
Hola,
Hi,
Rosa.
Wonderful presentation, first of all, amazing, and so good to see it out on the screen like this. Here's my question. I have a couple questions, but the first one is this. I never really quite understand the interchangeable use of the terms cast concrete and cast stone. I've seen them used interchangeably. I've never actually seen an analytical difference between the two in any place I've ever worked, but I wonder if you're using the terms deliberately, or are they just interchangeable?
No, cast stone is like a concrete block. It's a piece that's made with a mold. Cast concrete is cast in place.
Okay,
A
okay.
wall, or as a roof, or as anything else. So they're elements, they're individual, independent elements.
Perfect. So the cast stone would be used to describe cast elements, and
Yes.
cast concrete you're using for like poured in place, right?
Exactly.
And secondly, if I may, when you speak of waterproof and fireproof concrete, is there anything that's being done to it that's different than just the natural process of cast concrete, which is in itself fireproof and waterproof, if done
Well,
correctly?
in the blocks that Purdy and Henderson designed, they had an interior covering of tar. So that tar sort of waterproofed. You know, they had very, very exotic ways of trying to eliminate the high water table coming into the buildings. And they had pumping systems, and this was really early as early as 1908. So they thought these blocks would work, and I saw the blocks in the Hotel Nacional, in the what was the Banco Nacional, which was being worked on, and they're still there, and there's no water, so they
But are
work.
you seeing, did you see you saw the tar layer as well?
Yes, I did.
Wow, that's cool.
And they're still there. They're still there, and that was the only building I could actually go in there, because I negotiated with the structural engineers that were doing the project. I said, I have all the structural drawings that you don't have. I'll give you the drawings if you let me in. And he said, okay, you can come in now. So
Great trade.
and he said, do whatever you want. And I said, I will stay here as long as I need to be in order to find all these. So I documented those as well. Yeah.
That's wonderful. Thank you.
It was just amazing how much new materials were put into work as early as 1902 and 1903.
Right.
It's amazing. Really.
Yeah.
Is.
Do you know if they patent any of it? Sorry, Rosa, do you know
go ahead.
if?
Yes, they have. As a matter of fact, Purdy and Henderson have several patents. They're included in my thesis, but I was not able to find the patent for the block, unfortunately. But engineer Purdy himself did have several patents that are included in my thesis.
Cool. Somebody posed a question as the speed. Where can we find some of Beatriz's research? This is from Sally Plunkett.
On academia.edu, academia.edu. Some of my research work is there. And
someone needs to publish this book.
Yes.
No, it is going to be published. The Polytechnic University of Valencia offered to publish it themselves. So I'm
awesome.
ecstatic.
And webs.
Great.
That is
Great. That's terrific.
that is.
Well, anyways, you can look up our website, which is Pantel del Cueto at, no, wait, because we changed it recently.
.com.
Eh?
.com.
Panteldelcueto.com. I have my husband here reminding me. Okay. Pantel, Pantel del Cueto, which is my last name as well, .com.
I put it in the chat. Hopefully I spelled it correctly. Oh, I sent it only to Rosa. I meant to send it to everybody else. There you go.
So good. I mean, yeah, a million questions, but
Well, yeah. Well, whatever, you can write to me too. My email, either Lourdes or Becky can share my email, and you can write to me, and I'll be more than happy to give you any information I can provide. And Rosa, just so you know, and I told Lourdes too, I'm looking forward to presenting it in Cuba as well. Because
That's great.
I did this for them more than for me, because
Sure.
they kept saying it's Purdy and Henderson, and I kept saying, who are these people? And when I started researching them, they were an amazing engineering firm in the United States. So I mean, if they were the engineers for such important buildings in the United States, and they took their talent into the Caribbean, not only in Havana, I chose Havana just because it had the most important buildings, but in Santo Domingo, in the Dominican Republic, and in Puerto Rico, we have buildings by them.
Right, right.
There's a question on the chat about, I lost it here. Have you found that buildings in cities near ports in the US have used identical forms of construction you found in Cuba? This person is listening from Baltimore. Thank you, welcome.
No, I don't. I haven't done that research. I was mainly concerned with the islands themselves, because we become so isolated in our own realm that I didn't take it that far. But, I hope to be able to see if the same technology and knowledge that was transferred from the US and from the old world into the Caribbean came out of the Caribbean and changed their work. I'm sure it was their experiences in Cuba influenced their later work. For example, in Manhattan, where they had the other big branch. So it would be interesting to see, what their footings were like, what the water table attention to that was, and if they employed the same pumping mechanisms in the island of Manhattan when they came back from
Right.
Cuba.
Well, I just spend and it's a little bit different, obviously, but I spend a week in Panama with a family and having grown up there, and I did some research when I was a graduate student, the technology of all that was developed for the construction of the canal makes you wonder how much was that being, because I remember sitting in the library looking at National Geographics of 1910, talking about all the different, materials and equipment that was being developed as they built the canal, which means that anything that perhaps Purdy and Henderson were doing could have also been published and expand beyond their border. Right? So that's one of the reasons I asked about the patent, because it's kind of very interesting, the work they were doing.
No, and it's interesting, and I agree with you. The Panama Canal was a major undertaking which required tons and tons of cement and rock and cutting and drilling and bursting, but they were, it's scary to think about it, but they were really experimenting with cement during this period. They were testing it to see it, to push it to its utmost strength, to see what would hold. So when you think of the construction of the Panama Canal, the Panama Canal and its scale, it's overwhelming.
Yeah.
Think what how they were so brave to risk it that way, because I'm talking about a basement in a building, and a basement in a building to a canal, and going through a whole country is another thing.
Well, in if I may, in Havana, they didn't always succeed either. There were lots of places where the concrete was made with inferior aggregate and that wasn't rinsed properly. And those buildings have a lot of problems, mainly Centro Habana, that neighborhood.
Yeah, but because those were probably the early uses of cement, right?
Correct. They're the earliest ones that were throwing up all these apartment buildings really fast to bring in people that were there coming in to do the construction of all the other public works.
And Rosa, the other thing that could have happened also is that they were using beach sand.
That's what I'm saying. Yeah, that's what I mean. Yeah, they were using unrinsed salt-rich aggregate, and you can see it.
Which we have here in Miami Beach.
No, which we have everywhere that's near the ocean, and it's a big temptation when you look at those colonial buildings, and you see that they used salt. They didn't have hoses, they didn't have flowing water, so they depended on basic cleaning or no cleaning at all, and the sand is still there, but
Right.
it eventually, you know, affects buildings that have less wide, less width. And you can
Less thickness to the,
see, exactly.
right.
So, you know, my Spanish gets in the way sometimes,
This is wonderful.
most times, anyway.
This is really good. This is an amazing presentation, and I can't wait when it's published so we can all buy it.
I'm
Are you
glad.
printing it in English or in Spanish, by the way?
Well, it's probably going to be published in Spanish because I wrote it in Spanish, but I told them that I was willing to have it translated, so it would be the two languages. Because I think it's important that this information, as a matter of fact, I was going to present it at the Construction History Society in Chicago next month. And I was dying to go to Chicago and actually, you know, present this to the really knowledgeable guys in skyscraper design and see what they thought. And they were really interested to see what I was going to say, because most of them didn't even know that Purdy and Henderson had built anything in Cuba. So that's like a secret within
Wow.
a secret, you know? So I said, yeah, and they're really important buildings. So it's not like they built a little church here or a little hardware store there. It's the major building, especially the Capitol. That was a major undertaking. And you know, it also shows that they, you know, in order to keep their foot in the door, they were able to do a lot of things. Like the Capitol's building, it took 3 years to build, with 1,000 men working every day, 400 people at night. And that's an ambitious, more than ambitious project, you know, and they were just, they united the studio that was designed, you know, Purdy and Henderson studio with the studio of the Department of Public Works. And they designed as they built, you know, so the design build thing is not a new thing. They did it as they had to do, because they had to meet, I didn't say it, but they had to meet the deadline for a Congress that had been promised by the previous government, the Pan American Congress. And they had promised to celebrate it within the Capitolio. So even though they were fast tracking everything, when they found out they weren't going to finish, then they said, okay, we have to throw some kind of money to the University of Havana, because we need a place for the Congress. So that's why they did it without going through subastas, bids or anything, just because they wanted to finish the University of Havana for the Congress, and they were able to finish the staircase for that Congress.
Oh, wow.
That gave them extra time to finish the Capitolio. But it still must have been a sight, you know, in 1927, 28, 29, to have, you know, gazillion people working on the site all the time, and the noise and everything else. But it was very interesting to also find out that the Cuban government demanded national products to be used. They demanded that the quarries, the stone, that everything had to be Cuban, which is bad with regards to natural resources, but it's good in the sense that they were using products from their own land.
Well, and I think Purdy and Henderson were very innovative, not only in experimenting, but, you know, their business model is like, okay, do I need contractors? I need inspectors. I need, you know, so, you know, not much in a lot of ways, many things have changed. We still have to be very creative, and these type of large firms and constructions that we have to sort of have
And they were
a lot of hats.
Yeah, and they still were not Cuban, so they kept saying in every ad I found, they said our plantilla, or our workforce, is 98% Cuban, so that they would not be told, you know, you're Americans and you have no place here, or you whatever. But another, you know, I have 2 minutes, I guess I can tell the story. It's a very short story. Something that was funny about, you know, them organizing themselves to do these projects. They at one point, the Hotel Nacional became not Nacional because everything was done in New York. The bankers, the designers, you know, it was McKinley and White. It was the contractors from the United States. It was the structural engineers from Purdy and Henderson. It was the National City Bank. So everything came from New York. So Cubans really went into a protest regarding the Hotel Nacional, saying there's nothing Cuban about it. So that's another little story that I found within everything else.
That's great. That's really, really good. Well, thank you so much, Beatriz, for sharing your
You're welcome.
amazing research. I'm sure you have tons and tons and more information. So I'm looking forward to getting the book when you publish it. My grandfather was an architect in Cuba,
Great.
so I'm sure he was one of those people who perhaps, you know, either saw it or worked there, because he actually was an engineer back then. He had to train for both back in the early 1900s.
Like here in
right.
Puerto Rico, yeah.
Right. So and he actually worked for Public Works for a while. So
great.
he probably knew all of those people, but of course he's long past, but I'm sure he was very much a part of that, you know, exciting, dynamic, busy city that Cuba was after the Spanish-American War, and despite all the American influences. If you know your little, I'm sure you know the history, so you know, it gets a little
Yeah, I
complicated.
know the history. Yeah.
Yes. So
But anyways, I'm here. Anyone that needs a little more information, I'm happy to provide it.
yes,